Hey class, we're going to give you a quick rundown here of some of the research methods. Generally, I only cover two research methods in any amount of detail, and three of them I just leave for students to get on their own. The information from the textbook is sufficient for those. But before we get into the research methods, let's just kind of talk a little bit about the scientific method. Any discipline that is considered a science uses the scientific method as a way to collect data and analyze the data. And as you can see on the screen is a little chart that kind of shows how the scientific method works. And what we're going to focus on is the type of studies, this area right here, the different study designs or research methods that can be used to collect data. So these are the research methods that I generally do not cover specifically in class. They're listed in your book. Pretty self-explanatory, but feel free to contact me if you have any questions about these. Case studies, naturalistic observations, surveys, and interviews. What I spend most of my time on in more detail are experiments and correlational studies. And I like to cover experiments first because once you understand what experiments are and what kind of conclusions we can draw from those, then it's easier to see what some of the limitations of correlational research are. I know that might not make sense right now, but you'll have to trust me on this. So the topic we're going to start with right now is experimental research. And experiments are kind of unique because this is a research method where a researcher can like manipulate a variable or change a variable on purpose, and then we can measure the effect that that change has on something else. Because of that, experiments are the only research method that are used to determine cause and effect relationships between two variables. So we can deliberately change one variable. We observe the effects of that change on a second variable, and if the second variable changes as a result of the first, then we can indicate that the first variable caused the second variable to change. And again, this is something unique about experiments, and that's why experiments are the only research method that allows us to determine the causes. As we work through an example here, hopefully you'll see exactly why that is, what's unique and special about experiments. So first of all, the independent variable is the variable that the researcher will manipulate or change on purpose. You might think of this as the thing that participants in the experiment are going to be exposed to. Right? The researcher is exposing them to something on purpose. And the group that receives the independent variable, those participants, we call them the experimental group. So as an example, on your screen, it says Dr. Baldwin studies the effects of music on memory. She designs an experiment in which half the group listens to music while studying a list of nonsense syllables, and the other half of students study the list without music. Word recall is tested 1 hour later. So what is the independent variable in the study above? Or in other words, what is the researcher changing or manipulating on purpose? What is the researcher exposing participants to? It's the music. That's right, participants are being exposed to music, and that's what they're being exposed to. The researcher is manipulating that or changing that on purpose, and that's called the independent variable. The dependent variable in an experiment is the variable that we think is influenced by the independent variable. Its value depends on the independent variable. That's why we call it the dependent variable, because its value depends on the independent variable. So basically, this is the variable that the researcher will measure. So let's look back at the same experiment. He had people study a list of nonsense syllables while listening to music. Music was the independent variable. So what is the dependent variable? What was the researcher measuring? You might say memory. He was studies the effects of music on memory. He must have been measuring memory. Well, in a sense, you're right. But how was he measuring memory? More specifically, what was he measuring to determine if music had an effect on memory? The dependent variable is word recall. The researcher was measuring the number of words recalled from that list of nonsense syllables that the people were studying. That's the variable that was measured. So if we have our experimental group was listening to music, and let's just say that the list of nonsense syllables was 50 of them. So they were going to study a list of nonsense syllables, 50 nonsense syllables, while they're listening to music. And so some examples of nonsense syllables might be like piv and ort, whatever. The reason people might the reason the researcher would want them to study nonsense syllables is because some participants in the study probably have larger vocabularies than others. And you don't really want some people outperforming a lot of others just because they have a large vocabulary already. We really kind of want everyone in the study to participate at an equal level. So if we give everyone a list of nonsense syllables, these are words that nobody would really have stored in memory. So everyone in the study is pretty much equal in terms of their ability on this task already. So let's just say out of the 50 words, on average, the participants in the experimental group recalled 35 out of 50 words on average, meaning some recalled more, some recalled less, but when you average them all together, this group recalled about 35 out of 50 words. What can we conclude from that? Does it now appear that music does in fact cause better word recall or have a positive effect on memory? I guess we wouldn't know for sure, right? Because we don't really know if 35 out of 50 words is good or not. So we're missing something here. An important element in most experiments is having a control group. We need a group to compare our experimental group to. We call those control groups. This is a group that does not receive the independent variable. So in other words, this group is not listening to music, but they're still going to perform the same task as the experimental group by studying a list of 50 nonsense syllables. They're just doing it without the music. And what if we did that and the average word recall for that group was 35 out of 50 words? So basically the same as the experimental group. Now what can we conclude about the effects of music on memory? It appears that music really doesn't have an effect on memory, or specifically this word recall task. Now, let's ignore those results. And I'm going to show you some more results. Let's pretend that the results for the experimental group was 35 out of 50, but the result for the control group was 13 out of 50. Now what can we conclude about the effects of music on memory? It appears that music has a positive effect on memory because the experimental group recalled a lot more words on average than the control group. Let's ignore those results though. And let's say the results for the experimental group was an average of 12 out of 50 words recalled, and the results for the control group was 38 out of 50. Well, now we see the control group performed much better than the experimental group. If those were the results, then we conclude that music actually has a negative effect on memory because the control group performed better and they were listening to no music. The point here, though, is without a control group, we don't really know how to interpret any of these results. We need something to compare these results to see if music was really helping or harming memory. So, how confident can we be that it was the music that caused the higher number of words recalled? That is, looking at the results above here now, The experimental group recalled 35 out of 50 words. The control group recalled 13 out of 50. So the experimental group did a lot better. How confident can we be that it was the music that caused the higher number of words recalled? Remember, experiments is the only research method that allows us to identify causes of things. In other words, how confident can we be that it was the independent variable, the music, for example, that caused the higher number of words recalled, the dependent variable? Well, there's a couple things we would have to know. We'd have to be confident that everything else about the experimental group and the control group were the same. For example, there's lots of things that could affect how many words the people in each group recalled. We want the only thing to affect the number of words recalled to be the music. But there are other things that could have too. For example, did the two groups have the same list of nonsense syllables? Let's say they did. Now, both groups had the exact same list of nonsense syllables. So now, when the experimental group outperforms the control group, we can be confident that they didn't have an easier list of nonsense syllables to learn. So it eliminates that as a cause of their better performance. How much time did you give the experimental group to study the list of words? Let's say we gave them 15 minutes. Well, let's say the control group also got 15 minutes. That's good, because now the fact that one group outperformed the other, it couldn't be caused by the fact that they had more time to study the list of words. So when you're designing an experiment, you kind of have to think ahead of time about what other thing could affect their performance or affect the dependent variable, and what can we do to make sure that those are the same for both groups. Here's another one. How much time does the experimental group have to recall the list of words? Well, let's say we gave them 15 minutes. And we would also give the control group 15 minutes to recall the list of words as well. What environment or room was the experimental group in during this time when they were studying and listening to music? And what environment or room was the control group in when they were studying the list of words? We would want those environments to be almost identical, as similar as possible, because you wouldn't want, if one group is in a more comfortable, quiet room while they're recalling words than another, that could affect how many words they recall. The point is, if we keep all of these other variables down here the same for both groups, then we can be sure that any difference in the dependent variable, like 35 out of 50 words versus 13 out of 50, that difference in those results must have been caused by just one thing. That is, whether or not they were listening to music. And that ultimately was the whole point of this experiment, was to understand if music has an effect on memory. So what about all these variables down here? Well, we call those control variables because the researcher controls them and keeps them the same for both groups. Control variables are essential to experiments. Without control variables, we can't be sure what's causing these two numbers, the results for the two groups, to differ. But without these control groups, if these are all the same for both groups, then we can be confident that the only thing that caused the experimental group to perform better was the music. And again, that was the purpose of the experiment. We can pinpoint the cause of their better performance as being the music. Sometimes when we're doing drug research or any kind of substance that people can ingest, or cream, like treatments for rashes or something, sometimes we call the control group the placebo group. And that would be a group of people who are taking a fake substance. And so we would have an experimental group taking the real drug, for example, and a control group taking a fake pill. Now, they don't really know they're taking a fake pill. What we have to do in this situation is tell everybody ahead of time that some of them are going to get a real pill with active ingredients, and some of them